The veiled woman swung around, caught off guard by the voice. She found herself face to face with a pair of pointy ears. She looked down and saw a petite half-elf with a bag of roasted nuts in her arms, crunching on them as she cocked her head in suspicion. The veiled woman balked. "You can see me?" Underneath the veil was the stoic, businesslike expression of Melita Ponia, now overcome with a tinge of surprise. She recognized the half-elf. She had remembered catching a glimpse of her back in St. Soniel. The half-elf had the combat power of a goose, yet could see through Melita's concealing spell. Amber munched on the nuts and shrugged. "Is it supposed to be difficult to see you?" Naturally, Amber did not remember the voice or the vague impression of Melita. "Who exactly are you? A pedder? Does this territory finally have merchants coming and going?" Melita smiled a little under her veil. "If you must call me a merchant, perhaps you wouldn't be so wrong." She flicked her hand and the concealing spell disappeared. No one else was around, thankfully, so they didn't have to bear witness to someone appearing out of thin air. Melita eyed Amber carefully, who still didn't recognize her. "You are Duke Cecil's guard, correct? Please take me to him. I have business to discuss with the Grand Duke." Amber tossed 2 more roasted nuts in her mouth and nodded. "Oh, okay." She held out her hand. 3 copper coins. Melita raised an eyebrow. "What? Why?" Amber crunched on the nuts. "For leading the way." Melita scoffed. "How bold! You don't have a career interest in the Mithril Vault, do you?" Amber faltered. "Huh?" She finally took a good look at Melita. Her appearance plus the term Mithril Vault caused her to jolt up in shock and back away several steps. "Ah, Mithril Vault, you're the one that barged in that night in St. Soniel," Melita smiled. "That's right, your feudal lord invited me here, so would you still like the fee for showing the way?" Amber pouted. "I thought I could get a little extra something. What a shame." She looked up and gestured for the Mithril agent to follow. "Come with me. I'll take you to him." After weaving through the depths of the territory, Melita arrived swiftly at the big tent. A foundation had been built next to it with bricks, woods, and rocks piled aside. Preparations to build a house looked to be underway, it seemed, yet the tent remained. Amber stopped outside. "He's inside. At this time, he's probably taking his afternoon nap. Wait here. I'll let him know you're here." Melita could hear the half-elf grumbling as she disappeared behind the tent flap. "I'm not Gawain's assistant. Why am I acting like a stupid assistant?" Melita nearly laughed when she heard Amber raise her voice. "Chief, the agent My Little Pony is here for you." Yet again she heard her name pronounced in the weirdest way. Shortly after, Melita was invited into the tent, where Gawain sat by a desk. He saw her in her simple dress and lilac veil, with the same mysterious yet elegant disposition that he remembered from the previous meeting. He stood and smiled. "Long time no see, Miss Melita. I thought you would take a long time to come. After all, the transport in this area isn't very convenient. Please take a seat." Melita returned the smile. "The Mithril Vault always has many channels. I'm very glad that you've finally pronounced my name correctly." Gawain ran his hand through his hair and chuckled. "Don't be so sure. I might still pronounce it wrong the next time." Melita sat down before Gawain. The Grand Duke is really quite the character. Gawain sat back and held open his arms. "So you've seen the territory. What are your thoughts?" Melita nodded. "It's really quite nice. There are many unusual, magical devices from what I can see. More curiously, however, you're living in this tent, while the civilians are in wooden shacks." Gawain shrugged. "The majority of the cabins are workshops or lodging for craftsmen and tradesmen. The infrastructure of the territory is my top priority. I will have my own woodhouse in due time, yet even then..." Gawain thought about the cement buildings but decided not to go in length about them. Even so, he saw Melita's eyes widened in surprise. "What is it?" Melita shook her head and regained some composure. "Nothing. I just thought those were barracks for your knights and soldiers. Do you not plan to erect a castle?" Gawain waved his hand dismissively. "We'll see about it in the future. It's a big waste to do so now." He leaned forward. "Anyways, shall we get down to business?" Melita nodded. "Of course. Please let me have a look at the ring you found." Gawain fished out the mithril ring that he had gotten from the cultist, placed it on the table, and pushed it in front of Melita. Melita's eyes narrowed the moment she saw the silver ring. Her countenance grew solemn, and Gawain knew immediately that ring must be real. Doing her due diligence, Melita picked up the ring and examined it, stroking the inner bevel to ready the encrypted patterns. She lifted the ring to her lips and uttered a few syllables. Gawain couldn't make out what she was saying. In fact, the voice was in such a low register, it didn't seem possible for human vocal cords to make. As soon as the syllables were spoken, the surface of the ring glowed and vibrated. After a good second, the glow disappeared. The vibrations stopped. Melita exhaled and set the ring down. Indeed, this is a real mithril ring. It is the token of a VIP client. The name of the ring's owner is Bard Wendell. Gawain frowned. He didn't recognize the majority of important figures of the present era, but he was very familiar with important surnames. I've heard of the Wendell surname before. There was a hothead surnamed Wendell amongst the batch of people who pioneered eastward back then. Melita drew a sharp breath. That's right. Bard Wendell is a descendant of the Typhon Empire's Wendell clan. You should be able to remember. The Wendell clan is as ancient as your Cecil clan. In fact, it is already one of the most prestigious clans in the Typhon Empire. Duke Ferdinand Wendell of the present era is the Typhon Empire's strongest and most reputable Night Lord, and a descendant of the hothead you mentioned. Gawain frowned. Night Lord? What kind of lord is that? Melita exuded fear as she answered. It's a unique title created after the Typhon Empire went through their military system reform. They reorganized and registered all knights, warriors, mages, and all other types of warriors forming the Empire Corps. No longer would they rely on the private armies of individual aristocrats. Of the titles within this Empire Corps, the Night Lord is the highest. Duke Ferdinand Wendell is the man that commands all of the Typhon Empire's soldiers. Gawain's brows knitted together. They built a standardized military system. Melita nodded warily. Indeed. Their military has expanded greatly over the last decade. Gawain clenched his fists. What is Anzu doing? I didn't get any of this information when I inquired about it back in the capital. Melita shrugged. Even the king may not have the slightest idea about the things happening in the neighboring empire. The Typhon Empire has made deliberate efforts to keep up a wall in communication. I can tell you more about it all later. But first, we ought to discuss this Bard Wendell and his ring. Gawain nodded and refocused. You're right. So this Bard Wendell, what is his relationship with the Night Lord? Melita answered promptly. Bard Wendell is Duke Ferdinand's only son. More importantly, he'd been missing and presumed dead for 10 years. Gawain raised an eyebrow. Heir of the Wendell clan, Night Lord of the Typhon Empire, there's indeed nothing odd if he were a major client of the Mithril Vault, but the man I fought against in Tanzan Town was a druid, a cultist of the Oblivion Association. He pointed at the ring. Whoever I met must have stolen Bard Wendell's ring. Melita shook her head. Unfortunately, that is not the case. What I did just now was check the records of this ring. And besides your contact, this ring hasn't been touched by anyone else who does not match the identity. In other words, this ring had been previously worn on Bard Wendell's hand the whole time. It has never changed hands, until you picked it up. Gawain was stunned, speechless. As thoughts spiraled in his head, countless details flashed across his mind. When I fought the cultist, he instinctively went into close combat. Even when he possessed sorcery, he chose to lurk in the shadows with his blade. In the fight, the cultist displayed outstanding swordsmanship. Clearly, he had a renowned master, someone perhaps like Ferdinand Wendell, the Night Lord of the Typhon Empire. Memories of another lifetime swirled, piecing together the larger puzzle. The pioneering Wendell clan who went east was led by Tillian Wendell. He was a master of single-handed blades. The cultist I fought had the same blade and the same fighting style. What turned Bard Wendell, son of the Night Lord of the Typhon Empire, into the Oblivion Association cultist? What occurred over the last 10 years since he went missing? Gawain's mind swirled with questions. He faced Melita Ponya. How much do you know about the Wendells? Melita smiled a little. The Mithril Vault isn't a specialized intelligence organization. What we know is limited to the matters that can be circulated and do not involve confidentiality. What I can tell you is, Bord Wendell is Duke Ferdinand Wendell's only son. He was brilliantly gifted and diligent and a pious believer of Care, the god of war. He received elite education and the guidance of the God of War sect at a young age. At the age of 10, he exhibited spiritual gifts of Care. He swiftly grew to become a powerful, revered knight, his capabilities drawing comparable to the higher ranks. He was considered the most outstanding supernatural figure of Typhon's previous generation's youths. Gawain raised an eyebrow. So his combat rank is that of a revered knight? Melita nodded. At least that's what everyone says. Gawain stroked his chin. When he fought me, he displayed great swordsmanship, but there wasn't the slightest hint of Care's divine power. All his magical abilities came from druid magic. Melita could only guess. Perhaps something caused him to lose the blessing of the god of war. This might be the reason for him devoting himself to a heretic cult. Gawain pulled at a loose thread. You mentioned Bard went missing 10-odd years ago. What happened? Melita sighed. After completing God of War Care's test, Bard Wendell officially relieved his father of the Wolf General title. This is a title that is passed down through their family clan. However, during a routine Anzu Typhon border mission, he and a team of elite knights were sent to conduct reconnaissance outside of town and walked into a cloud of thick fog in the open view of everyone. They disappeared in the fog. 3 days later, several knights were found wandering in the wilderness. They had all gone mad. Bord Wendell was never found. Melita paused for a moment. In recent years, the relationship between Typhon and Anzu has severely deteriorated. The disappearance of Bord Wendell also aggravated diplomatic relations. The Typhon people believe that Anzu used sorcery to plot against their commander, while the Anzu people believe that this was a self-directed farce by Typhon, an excuse to rally more troops. Back then, the two sides nearly declared war right then. But when the situation was at its worst, Bard Wendell's father, Duke Ferdinand, declared that the disappearance of his only son had nothing to do with Anzu, stopping the outbreak of war. Gawain crossed his arms. Ferdinand Wendell, is he a pacifist? Melita shook her head. The contrary, really. He served as a high military official of Typhon before that incident, and he remained a firm advocate of war. The many military reforms that the Typhon Empire underwent had been requested on his behalf. So when the old Duke came forward with his declaration, everyone was surprised. Since then, the old Duke went from a fierce advocate of war to never speaking on the matter again. He continued driving Typhon's military reforms but delayed the Empire's border operations. Although many facts subsequently proved that his judgment had been right, this change in his attitude remains a mystery. Gawain sorted out everything, Melita said. A young, prodigious wolf general goes missing. 10 years later, he shows up in the south of Anzu, in Tanzan town, gone with the powers of a revered knight. This former wolf general now uses druid magic. His father, meanwhile, goes from asking belligerently for war to maintaining the shaky peace. What is the connection here? What would make Bard Wendell lose his blessings from the god of war? Gawain bit down on his tongue as a revelation came. What if Bard Wendell learned that the gods were dead? The more the thought unravelled, the more it made sense. Bard Wendell discovered the truth. It caused him to abandon his faith. He lost the powers of the god of war. Gawain stopped himself. Does it work like that? Does blind faith give followers a pale imitation of divine blessings? Is that what theurgy amounts to? Bard Wendell was said to have significant talents. Gawain found himself at a dead end with his train of thoughts. If the gods were dead, prayers would be useless. Pious followers would be unable to obtain any sort of blessings. Yet Bard Wendell did, yet many others have as well. Melita watched as the Grand Duke stroked his chin, lost in a daze. Duke? Gawain jolted back to his senses. Right, I want to know, does Bard Wendell have any offspring? Melita nodded. He has a young daughter, Andresha Wendell. Now that more than 10 years have passed, the young girl has grown up and she carries on the honour of the Wendell clan. Her swordsmanship is as outstanding as her father's. As of now, Andresha is a Night Lord of the Typhon Emperor, commander of a regiment of the Empire's Order of Knights. The outside world believes that it would only take a few more achievements before Andresha Wendell takes over the title of Wolf General, like her father, becoming the next head of the Wendell clan. Gawain leaned forward. So, this Andresha Wendell also worships the god of war. She is also a revered knight like her father. Melita nodded when she stopped herself. Well, actually, from my sources, Duke Ferdinand forbade Andresha from converting to any religion. To this day, she is a non-believer. Gawain knitted his brows together. Interesting. Interesting. Melita smiled cordially. Duke, this is all the information that I can provide. Has anything come to mind? Gawain heaved a consternated breath. The biggest mystery still remains unanswered. How did a revered knight become a cultist druid? Thank you for all this information. If you had not come, I would have never guessed that the cultist's identity would belong to someone of the Typhon Empire. Melita's eyes narrowed. Would you like to spread the word on this matter? The true identity of an Oblivion Association druid in Anzu, who is actually an ex-aristocrat of Typhon. The value of this news cannot be measured by a few coins. Gawain shook his head. No, it's pointless to spread such things. No one will believe it. With all the current tensions between the kingdoms, something like this will sound like mere propaganda. A plume of shadows appeared beside Gawain, and Amber leaped out. Even if the people of Anzu and Typhon won't take it seriously, at least it'll scare the cultist. Gawain chuckled. This man is a cultist. Do you think he would care about his reputation? Melita shook his head. The Duke is right. She rose from her seat and brought her hands together. Do you have any questions for me, Duke Cecil? Gawain thought for a moment and looked up at her. I do. The Mithril Vault probably collects a considerable amount of treasure, right? Melita's lips curved into a gentle smile. There is such a saying. At any point in time, the Mithril Vault houses a collection of half the treasures in this world. It is precisely because we are able to retain such a massive amount of wealth that important figures choose to let us safeguard their wealth. Gawain nodded. Are there things in your vault that can be sold? Melita hesitated for a moment but followed up with a smile. Of course. There are always treasures that have left their owners, and there are always rare treasures that no one shows any interest in. We are very happy to find them new owners, supposing, of course, that they are willing to pay a suitable price. Gawain stood up to meet Melita's eyes. What's the price for a piece of the Eternal Stone Tablet? Melita Ponya was graceful, and by every outward appearance it seemed like nothing could faze her short of pigs flying. But when Gawain asked about the Eternal Stone Tablet, her eyes bugged out, her mouth dropped open, and she practically gagged in surprise. Amber guffawed, spewing half-chewed nuts. Gawain put his hand over his mouth to hide his amusement. But just as soon as the agent of the Mithril Vault had the cartoonishly over-the-top reaction, she returned to normal. She adjusted her veil and cleared her throat ever so slightly. The Eternal Stone Tablet, you say? Gawain nodded. Of course. Obviously I'm not talking about the entire tablet, just a piece of it. How much would that go for in today's market? Though her face had returned to its normal, unflappable appearance, Gawain could see the curiosity blazing in her almond-shaped eyes. My lord, you sound like you're buying cabbage. Surely it's blasphemy to speak this way about objects that came from the gods themselves. Gawain flinched. It had been a while since he'd made a cultural faux pas in this world. Unfortunately, even though he had the memories of an ancient Anzu duke, he still lacked the decorum or personality that should follow. Gawain Gao retained his own personality. He thought of the shards as research materials, not the sacred relics that most people in Lauren considered them. I'm sorry, my lady. Dying truly does change one's outlook on the world, and the divine, too. I look at things more frankly now, but I appreciate being reminded of the stone tablet's import. However, I still have questions. Do you have any shards of the tablet in your collection? The lady smiled soothingly, a practiced gesture that revealed nothing. The fragments of the Eternal Stone Slate are in the hands of the major religions factions, Do you think a sacred order would trust their most prized relics to the hands of bankers? Gawain nodded, playing along. But of course, yet there are more than just a few shards in this world, besides the big ones. You and I both know that many exist, in the hands of collectors, nobles, even Francis II himself. Yet, I struggle to think of a bigger collector in Lorraine than the Mithril Vault. Behind her veil, Melita's immaculately curved brows came together. After a moment of thoughtful consideration, she spoke again. You are correct, Duke Gawain. We do have some shards of the Eternal Stone Tablet, but we hold them on behalf of our customers, just like we held those crystals which you stored with us for over 700 years, and our oath to our customers is sacred, so we would never reveal the fragment's owners. Not without their permission, of course. Gawain swore to himself. He knew better than to press her on this matter. He drummed his fingers on his desk for a moment, thinking about his next tactic. Melita slowly licked her lips, then spoke again. However, if you can wait for a little while, I might be able to negotiate for shards of the tablet on your behalf. Gawain blinked in surprise. This doesn't violate your sacred oath? Melita grinned in amusement. Finding loopholes is also sacred to us. I cannot reveal the client's information, but I can tell you that they have violated the contract with us, and we have it on good authority that they cannot settle their account with us. Perhaps their items will go on sale soon. Though Melita was speaking conversationally with a smile, Gawain noticed a sinister undercurrent to her words. He dreaded to imagine what the Mithril Vault would do to creditors who could not pay their debts. Amber shuddered noticeably. She muttered half to herself, You business people call us underhanded. Belch, you business people are truly frightening, the half-elf young lady couldn't help but mutter. Gawain ignored Amber and leaned forward. Well then, what price would the Mithril Vault hang on such a priceless artifact? He dreaded the answer to this question. Sure, the wealth he acquired for his clan was considerable, but it was still finite, and there was no telling what hefty sum the Mithril Vault would ask. Melita raised her shoulders barely an inch in a subtle shrug. The Eternal Stone Tablet cannot be valued with money, and as such we would not stoop so low as to sell it for coin. We would ask for something else, rare treasures. For instance, relics of the Gondolian Golden Age. The tone with which she said it gave Gawain the chills. Clan Cecil had amassed quite a few antiquities of that nature, but he had no idea how she knew this. She continued, Of course, if that is not amenable to you, we can settle for the crystals you withdrew from our vault earlier. Gawain nearly jumped out of his seat. The Mithril Vault had kept these crystals for him for hundreds of years. They might be aware of secrets of which even the old Gawain was unaware, but he couldn't ask directly about it. Are those crystals worth as much to you as a piece of the Eternal Stone Tablet? Melita Ponya placed her long fingers together. Her smile remained friendly but guarded, like a politician at the opposing party's conference. We categorize treasures in 3 types. The first is items that are special but man-made, and thus they can be remade. Jewelry, well-crafted garments, weapons, artwork. The second type includes treasures that were made by people, but the art has been lost to time, like objects from ancient Gondolia. The third type, her eyes twinkled. Well, those are artifacts not made by humans. Gawain nodded, understanding. And these crystals, the Eternal Stone Tablet, those were not met by humans, were they? Melita shook her head. They were not. Miles and miles away from Gawain's tense negotiations with Melita Ponya lay the most frightening monster ever encountered by humankind. Borderless, boundless, merciless. It would be calm one moment, then deadly in the next. It could bring vast wealth or destroy all in an instant. Underneath its roiling skin lay the most profound treasures and the most unimaginable horrors. It was the ocean. In Lorraine, as on Earth, humans had conquered almost the entire land, with the exception of the Gondolian wasteland, but they could not bring the ocean to heal. Beyond Lorraine's shores stretched the unfathomable waves. Though lighthouses could pierce the distance to a certain degree, ships could only go so far before the tide dashed them to pieces. Magic hung over the sea, so even experienced captains feared the mist that danced across the water's surface and played tricks on their minds. In days of yore, the only ones who could reliably navigate the waters beyond shorelight were clerics who worshipped the god of the storm. With their god's blessing, they could guide any ship into a true path between tempests and doldrums. Yet this was no longer the case. The Church of the Storm severed ties with orthodoxy and had turned to dark theurgy, scorning any who didn't adhere to their faith. They no longer worshipped the storm's god, but rather held fealty to the storm itself, believing that one day the tide would rise and consume the entire world. They left the continent and were no longer seen by the world. They called themselves the Sons of the Storm. So no ships dared venture into the tempestuous waters, lest they be consumed by the all-hungry beast that was the endless sea. In the modern era, shipping vessels and fishermen would stay close to the coast for safety's sake. Miles off the coast, beyond the light from lighthouses, the Sons of the Storm lived on islands. On a particularly large chunk of rock, they worked on repairs. Sheets of water fell from the sky, raindrops stinging the cultist's skin like hundreds of arrows. Forked lightning laced across the sky, illuminating everything in harsh white flashes. So much rain poured down that it felt like the storm meant to erode the very barrier of earth and sky, to make it all water. Yet even as bad as the storm was, the Sons of the Storm still carried out their repair work. They erected totems and set up sea barriers. They had been in the endless sea long enough to know what such a storm foretold: the coming of the sea demons. One of the acolytes stood at the top of a cliff on a lookout platform. He was a storm deacon and wore long black robes, which fluttered violently in the wind. He peered through the rain with a practiced eye, as he had long been trained to weather salt spray like a statue, indifferently. He stared into the dark seawater like it was the abyss itself. The endless sea was a fearful creature. The Sons of the Storm had worshipped it for so long that they had begun to treat it as if it was alive. It would sometimes attempt to deceive those that looked upon it and drive people to madness through mirages. Lightning flashed in the sky once more, illuminating the dark water. The rain seemed to pick up. The storm deacon felt his heart drop in his chest. Once the flash of lightning vanished, he saw shapes appear underneath the water. The shapes were difficult to discern amongst the storm, even for a seasoned lookout like him. He saw giant claws and fins. He beheld large teeth and giant, hungry eyes. He even thought he saw the shape of a human woman. Without hesitation, the storm deacon turned to the signal bell next to him. He grabbed the cord and heaved with all his might. Thunder boomed again, as if the storm itself sought to thwart his warning. Yet the storm deacon yelled still. His voice was louder than the thunder and twice as fearful. "The sea demons are here!" The rest of Gawain Cecil's meeting with Melitophonia was fairly uneventful. However, before she departed, she left Gawain with a promise. "As thanks for returning this ring and bringing this matter to our attention, we will alert you whenever there is a discovery of the sort we were just discussing." Prudence kept her from explicitly saying that they would let Gawain know when a fragment of the Eternal Stone Tablet was discovered. But Gawain was used to her euphemism-laden speech by this point. To Gawain, this promise was far more valuable than the ring. But after Melita left, Amber groaned. She walked over and lay down on top of Gawain's desk, grumbling. "You nobles don't know anything. That ring was valuable. Did you see the way she looked at it? And you let her have it for nothing, not even for a single copper coin. That mithril vault lady is just a miser." Gawain stood from his desk and walked over to his piles of books. "Do you not see the value of what she gave me? A promise of help for finding more pieces of the Eternal Stone Tablet." Amber blew a raspberry. "You can't buy anything with promises. Plus, it's not like they find a new shard of that tablet every day, you know? It's not like a random rock." She crossed her arms. "Well, at least when they find another in 100 years, you'll be the first to know." Gawain shook his head. He walked back to the table and pulled some blueprints out from under Amber. "Careful. These are more valuable than you are." She rolled her eyes at him. He smirked. "It is a miracle you've lasted this long in the world, especially since you seem to have no idea how to deal with people. Here, help me open this chest over here." He beckoned her as he walked over to a trunk that sat in the corner. The latches were badly rusted, so he couldn't grab them either at the same time. Amber sighed and slid off the table like a dead fish. She walked over to join him at the locked box. "Where's your pretty little maid? I thought she was helping you with stuff like this." Gawain grabbed one latch as Amber grabbed the other. The two forced the rusted metal to open. Smirking at her, Gawain looked at Amber. "Are you jealous now?" The half-elf nearly leapt out of her boots. "Jealous? I don't need your approval." Gawain chuckled. "Calm down, you imp. I gave Betty a half-day off in order to help Hazel settle in. She's afraid of strangers and mute. I thought Betty might be able to relate, at least on the fear part. We'll see if that experiment is correct." With a grunt, Gawain heaved open the chest. He made a mental note to get those latches fixed. From within the trunk, he pulled out a large bag. Amber regarded him curiously. "You and all your experiments. Even those of us who work for you might as well be elements in your rune circle." This assertion caught Gawain off guard. He gave Amber a curious look. "And you say you're not jealous?" As Gawain brought the bag over to his desk, Amber sighed and followed. "Fine then, I'll admit it. I admire you. At first I thought you were being fake when you were all friendly and unassuming." The rogue hopped back up on the desk and leaned toward Gawain. "But no, it's true. You are what you purport to be." Gawain smiled curtly. "Thank you." He then pushed her off the desk. Amber quickly caught herself mid-tumble and brushed herself off haughtily. But she didn't catch Gawain's eye as he emptied the bag onto his table. A series of crystals tumbled onto the surface. They were varying shades of dull grey. On average, they were about the size of a thumb. Some glowed faintly, but most only seemed to be low-powered items. Amber cocked her head. She wrinkled her nose at the gems. "What are those? Surely we need higher quality crystals than that." Gawain picked up one in his hands, then tossed it to Amber, who caught it out of reflex. "Magic storage crystals. Courtesy of a very grateful Viscount Andrew. Did you forget already? It's part of my latest deal with Tanzantown." Amber stared at the crystal in her hand in disbelief. "Storage crystals? Are you sure? These look like something somebody would use if they were trying to scam somebody." Gawain glared at her sharply. Amber set the crystal down on the desk and held her hands up defensively. "I'm only saying in theory. I wasn't going to scam anyone. That's Pitman's game." She pointed down at the crystals on the desk. "But I'm sure Andrew's pulling a fast one. Just look at them. These are clearly scrap." Gawain laughed. It was surprising, as well as a little satisfying, to see Amber so incensed about the idea that their clan was being swindled. Slowly getting a lone wolf to become a team player. "I think you're overstating it. These are better than scrap crystals, and we bought them for 3 silver coins a pound." Her eyes widening, Amber regarded the crystals suspiciously. "Well, that is cheap, but why do we need so many low-quality storage crystals? Practice for apprentice mages." Gawain held up his finger, like an instructor about to make a decisive argument. "Do you know what the biggest problem is with low-quality magic storage crystals?" Amber furrowed her brow. "That they can't store as much magic, and all the magic within dissipates after a short while." Gawain nodded. "Basically, the storage problem is easily fixable by quantity, but the dissipation is the bigger issue." While he explained to Amber, Gawain reached down to a drawer under the desk. He produced from the desk a small metal plate, hexagonal in shape. He set it on the desk. After all, what's the point of magic storage if the magic once stored is useless? But for this, we just need to change the method of thinking. Amber glanced down at the metal plate. It was about the size of a small plate, flat, and had symmetrical magical grooves across its face. "You made that in the steelworks?" Gawain nodded. "This is a base plate with a magic circle on it." Amber gasped. "Oh, right, that thing that Rebecca and Jenny drew." Gawain nodded. "The honeycomb magic web unit, yes. Now that it's been put onto a base plate, it can be used in all sorts of ways." Amber leaned over. She noticed a faint pulse of light coming from within the hexagonal disc. "So, it's constantly generating magic?" Gawain nodded. "Yes, but since it's so small, its magical capability is limited. That's why we need these." He pointed at the crystals. "We can put magical energy into those crystals. Then once they are charged, we can place it next to this plate, and the plate will guide the magical energy out before it dissipates. That's how this can become a temporary storage tool. Amber's eyes grew wide. She stared, not at the plate, but at Gawain himself. "Are you sure you used to be a knight?" Gawain scoffed. "Why would you ask that?" Amber folded her arms. "Well, you're a first knight I've ever known to have so many theories about magic. It's very unusual." Gawain waved his hand. "One has to learn. Be creative. Besides, this is still just a component to whatever we need to use it for. This is how we can start to create portable energy sources. I'm going to call it the magical electric capacitor." Amber furrowed her brows. "Electric? Are you planning on blasting electric arrows with it?" Gawain sighed. "Oh, I didn't think of that." He stroked his beard, contemplating. After a moment, he raised his hand again. "I have decided to call it a magic capacitor." Amber nodded slowly, still looking quite taken aback by this new invention. Gawain was about to go to work when, all of a sudden, they heard excited shouts coming from outside. Gawain rushed over to the side of the tent and picked up the sword of the founder, just in case. Meanwhile, Amber vanished into the air. Gawain rushed to the entrance of the tent and threw the flap open. He found Amber standing outside, pointing. Look, Chief, Byron is back." Just as she said this, Gawain caught a glimpse of Sir Byron, who was striding up the hill towards Gawain's command centre. The knight bowed. Gawain beckoned him into the tent. As the knight stood before him, Gawain could see the days of exploration writ across his face. He was covered in soot, dust and grime. His eyes were squinting as if he was still getting used to daylight again. "What is it, Sir Byron? What have you discovered?" The knight's silver beard split into a massive grin. "My lord, we found a hidden passageway in the depths of the ruins. It must be Gondolia's secret testing ground. There is equipment, training centres, supplies, and tons of written records. Manuscripts and documents aplenty." Gawain's eyes widened. His heart quickened in his chest. "Show me." Gawain hurried after Sir Byron. He'd never seen the old knight run with so much vim. They stopped at the entrance of the Dark Mountains research facility. "Come with me." Together, they navigated through the initial levels of the ancient fortress. After days of exploratory effort by Byron and his team, much of the early and middle levels of the facility had been mapped out. Byron had grown familiar with the space, walking confidently down the dark corridors as if it were his home. Gawain followed after, his curiosity piqued. Byron led him up a flight of grand stairs into a spacious hall with a high ceiling. For the Gondolian architects to deliberately carve out such an open space must have meant considerable labour. It also meant the space had been made deliberately large for whatever they were researching. Heidi followed after them, holding on to a magic crystal. She checked a rough map that Byron and his team had outlined. It depicted several corridors and rooms ahead. There were forked paths and special annotations to denote mysteries not yet uncovered. More than anything, the map spoke to the true scale of the fortress. Even after days of exploration, their map was filled with paths not yet mapped out. Amber, Heidi, and Gawain followed Byron into another spacious hall. Gawain noticed soldiers gathered around, inspecting a large door at the very end. Byron pointed at the door. "My lord, this is what we've discovered. The door was originally sealed, but we found a crack in the wall next to it where airflow was detected. The mechanism for the door seems to have broken." Gawain nodded. "I would assume that the contraptions of the Gondolian Empire cannot survive for a millennium. Please show me what you found." Byron took off his glove and placed his hand on a metallic panel. A distorted voice reverberated out after a short hum. "Detecting. Specimen subject. Stable vitals. Access granted. Opening quarantine doors." The large door shifted on its own, slowly opening. Byron stepped back. "The door closes on its own in precisely 5 minutes. The same device exists on the other side that can close the door immediately, too." Gawain didn't mind the door, however. He thought of what the voice had said. Specimen subject? Amber raced over to the metallic panel, ogling at it with a wondrous gaze. "This thing can talk? I heard that the elves and the warlocks can create talking magical puppets, but I have never... She placed her hand on the panel. It hummed and blared out the same metallic voice. Detecting. Warning. Not qualified. Indistinguishable target. Passageway closing. Alarm activated. Amber stepped back. Smile turned upside down. I didn't do anything. Gawain gripped the hilt of his sword. The threat of an alarm activating could mean anything. Traps, monsters, poison gas. Soldiers backed away. Everyone looked around in a tense silence, but nothing happened. Gawain relaxed. The facility's alarm system must be in disrepair. Heidi let out a breath of relief. What is going on exactly? Why didn't it work when Amber touched it? Gawain himself stepped up and placed a hand on the panel. It hummed and echoed out with a message that access had been granted. The door rumbled open once again. Amber stomped her foot angrily. It's a racist door! A racist door, I tell ya! Gawain stepped back. I think I understand what's going on. He turned to the others. Do you remember what Nicholas Egg mentioned? This facility was used for human experiments. When the device says specimen subject, it is probably referring to living people. In regards to stable vitals, it is checking if there are mutations of diseases. It means only healthy human beings can pass through the door, not a half-elf. Amber pouted angrily. So the door is racist. The others nodded along to Gawain's explanation. But he himself had more questions percolating in his mind. Is the purpose of this door really so simple? Was it perhaps just to prevent the escape of test subjects? Gawain knew standing there would not answer anything. He braced himself and took a step past the door into a corridor lined with metallic pillars. Amber passed through fearfully, but no alarms were raised and the door did not close as she walked through. The others followed in after Gawain. At the end of the corridor was another door, exactly the same as the one before. Gawain placed his hand on the panel. It buzzed and gave the same access granted message. Gawain's hand rested on his sword's hilt as the second door rumbled open. Heidi held the magic crystal up to illuminate the space behind the door. Gawain stepped through, finding himself inside a circular hall. White paint streaked the walls, coated in a thick layer of dust. Pipes and metallic pillars lined the wall and connected to dilapidated magical devices. All of the devices and piping converged at the center, where tube-like structures stood vertically on metal pedestals. Faint runes marked the lids of the vessels. Gawain exhaled. He wasn't sure if he walked into a magical experiment or a science experiment. The vessels were large enough for an entire human to be encased within it. The runes and magic circles along the lids must have been a means to maintain stasis or to provide stimulation to the subjects inside. It was a magic control panel. He imagined himself walking along the room as an archmage of Gondolier would, strolling past test subjects, taking notes. Heidi leaned forward at the faint runes. Incredible. Such complex rune combinations, such uniform components. How did they do it? Gawain observed the runes and let out a sigh. These runes were making use of the endless energy from the Azure Fount. These types of equipment required thousands of technical craftsmen, over 20 kinds of fundamental workshops, an entire set of complicated production machines, at least 1,000 standard parameters, and endless supplies of magic along with the entire Empire's technological support. Heidi shook her head in both awe and disappointment. How did we leave behind such advanced technology? Were we really unable to preserve any of it back then? Gawain nodded. Back then, Anzu Kingdom's first-generation pioneers worked hard to restore these things. But the Dark Wave set civilization back several centuries. The industrial process was gone. Blueprints may have been preserved, but manpower was severely lacking. We spent most of the time ensuring people wouldn't starve. There was no time to build anything like this, especially without the supply of magic from the Azure Fount. Amber raised an eyebrow. Was the Azure Fount really that great of a thing? Gawain shrugged. Perhaps it wasn't, given how everything relied on it. The Azure Fount was destroyed and everything else followed. It's just another way this world relies too heavily on magic. Gawain sighed and brought his attention back to the circular hall. Let's keep looking around. He brimmed with curiosity as he roamed the space. examining every little detail of the empty vessels strewn across the middle of the hall. He observed the pipes and the pillars that lined the walls, disappearing through carefully carved holes that led to somewhere else in the vast research facility. Gawain thought of the experiments Nicholas Egg had mentioned. What exactly were the Gondolian researchers studying? Nicholas Egg spoke of mutated humans with bloated flesh. He said the researchers called them divine evils. What could that possibly mean? Gawain scanned all the vessels, control platforms, magic-guided pedestals and sensors that had a history of 1,000 years. His eyes casually drifted to the surface of the wall in the vicinity. He froze. Large letters of the common human language were written across the wall. Humankind shall last forever, even if we defied the gods. Heidi, Amber and Byron gathered behind Gawain. All of them could see the same letters on the wall. Amber frowned. Humankind shall last forever, even if we defied the gods. What the heck does that mean? Why is it written in a place like this? Heidi crossed her arms. Is this implying that the gods want humans to go extinct? Gawain shook his head. We don't know. It could have symbolic meanings that we wouldn't understand. Still, even as he spoke the words, his mind went immediately to the eternal stone tablet. Gawain turned around to face Byron. You also mentioned discovering manuscripts and documents. Byron nodded. Yes, but they are rather fragile, and we didn't dare to touch them upon finding them. Byron led Gawain and the party over to a side of the room filled with paperwork. When the researchers were evacuating the facility, evidently they had left all their documents and research here. The paperwork was made of magic-infused parchment that was standard for all mages of the Gondolian Empire. For that reason, even after 1,000 years, the paper did not corrode. Though the manuscripts were intact, the ink had faded. Gawain took a rough glance and judged that at least half of all the text was illegible. Gawain sighed. At least there is the other half. Behind him, Heidi brought over some scrolls and a ceremonial quill imbued with magic. Heidi opened up an empty scroll and it immediately floated up in the air, hovering close around her. She walked forward and held the magic-imbued quill against the fragile ancient parchment. She lowered her head and muttered a quiet incantation. Magic surged from her body towards the quill. It floated out of her fingers and hovered up into the air. The quill drifted over to the opened scroll and began to write. The quill scribbles the faded words of the parchment onto the scroll, effectively restoring the text otherwise lost to time. Heidi watched as the quill did its work and sighed a breath of relief. I was afraid these words would be too old for a spell like this, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Gawain nodded, amazed by the convenience of magic. He drew close to the scroll as the quill continued to transcribe the contents of the old parchment. Gawain squinted, reading each word carefully. The sentences read less like coherent reports and more like the ramblings of a lunatic. Pay attention to it. It is watching me attentively from that festering flesh. It is inside my body. I want to go inside it too. No one shall survive. The end of time is arriving. Blasphemous behavior made us struggle whilst at death's door. Eat heartily, eat heartily. I have eaten the flesh of gods again. After living a century, they have not come. They still have not come, but I do not need them to come anymore. The world outside has already collapsed. Gawain frowned. Everything afterwards became a series of illegible scribbles, lines of unrecognizable symbols and shapes. It was not a result of Heidi's magic, but the mental state of the original writer themselves. Gawain scanned further where, a few manuscripts later, the indecipherable symbols became legible words again. It sleeps in the depths of Mother Earth. It sleeps in the depths of the ocean. It sleeps in the depths of the sky. It is calling my name, those murmurings. I can see it, the face of God. It smiles to me in the light. It is time to depart. I want to go to its nation. Ah, that is the greatest blessing. God has bestowed blood and flesh for us to share, and it turns out it is all for this day. Gawain could only see more sections of illegible handwriting, strange symbols and scribbles. The occasional word appeared, but none of them follow any structure or grammar. Heidi noticed it as well. She conjured a sculpture hand to flip carefully through the manuscripts. After verifying there wasn't any more valuable information, she halted her transcription spell. Amber leaned over. "So what does it say?" Gawain shook his head, deeply disappointed. "A lunatic's crazy talk. It looks like a person was abandoned in this facility, and these documents were left behind as the person gradually went mad." Still, something about the words rattled Gawain. His blood ran cold. The same happened to Amber, who stepped back. She looked at her arm, covered in goosebumps. "I think we should get out of here. Really, this place is giving me a very, very bad vibe." Before Gawain could agree, a rumble echoed out from behind him. Gawain drew his sword. Heidi lifted her staff. Amber was ready to throw her dagger. They watched a vessel in the middle of the circular hall shake. Liquid ran through a pipe and filled into the empty vessel. Large bubbles emerged to the surface as a figure in the liquid manifested. Gawain's eyes widened. He watched the illusory figure take shape, going from a mere illusion to bubbles to a physical body. The skin was blood red, the entire shape larger than that of a human body. It was an aberration, a monster of the dark wave, except it had a face that resembled a human's. Tightly shut eyes exuded agony and insanity. Gawain couldn't believe his eyes. It was something of a mix between a monster and a human, formed out of nothingness. The body writhed in the vessel, thrashing wildly against the container. Right as it might break through the glass, a fist turned translucent. It passed straight through the vessel. The rest of this monster-human hybrid passed through as well. Gawain pointed his longsword at the freed monster. "Take it out!" The monster staggered and groaned. "Hungry! Hungry!" It charged at a group of soldiers at the entrance of the hall. Gawain, Amber, Heidi and Byron leapt in at once. A flurry of blades clashed against the tough skin of the monster. Arcane spells blasted into the monstrosity's back. Gawain let his blade grow red-hot. He sliced at the monster's limbs, but it didn't appear to feel any pain. It lunged Amber, who ducked and stabbed at the bloated leg with her poisonous dagger. She retreated to the side and shrieked. A burst of shadows appeared around her, and she disappeared into the shadow realm. The monster swung wildly, barely missing Sir Byron, who sidestepped and drove his sword up the monster's side. It groaned and, knocked off balance, stumbled onto the ground. Rather than disintegrate like a typical aberration, it writhed and recovered as it slowly pulled itself back up. Gawain grimaced. "It's not dead yet." He charged forward again, aiming for the monster's back. But before he could sink his blade into flesh, Amber jumped out of the shadows. She pulled on Gawain's arm. "Dude, come! Quickly! There's something in the shadow realm!" Gawain had never seen the half-elf's face stricken into such a terrified look. He looked over to the monster, engaged in a battle against Byron, Heidi and a group of soldiers. Gawain gritted his teeth. "Hold the line, Byron, Heidi! Amber says there's a problem in the shadow realm." Heidi nodded as she conjured a sculpture hand to block the monster's charge. "Go! We'll keep this monster busy!" Gawain faced Amber. "Take me there, now!" Gawain's vision blurred as he stepped through a burst of shadows. All sounds and senses from the physical world faded in a blink of an eye. He staggered as he stepped into the black and white world of the shadow realm. Gawain gathered his bearings and looked around. The circular hall in this dimension had a pale luster. In the middle, a dark lump of moving smoke billowed. It sat exactly where all the vessels were in the physical world. Here there were no vessels, no metal pedestals, no pipes lining from the wall to the center. All there was this dark smoke, rising from a pool of crimson mud. The mud swirled on its own like a living organism, releasing a disgusting, squelching sound. In the black and white world of the shadow realm, the bloody mud squelched and swirled. As Gawain listened to the disgusting sound as he inched closer to the dark smoke billowing out from the strange substance, the more he listened, the more the squelching of the mud evened out into a guttural moan. It was the kind of sound that one would hear in the middle of a nightmare. No sense could be made out of the moaning. All it did was send a chill down his spine. The sheer existence of the mud gave him a queasy, uneasy feeling. Amber stayed close behind Gawain, hiding behind his back. Her appearance was the same distorted version of herself that Gawain had seen back in the forest, with inexplicably long white hair. But she was by far the least interesting thing in the room at this moment. She'd never seen anything so strange in the Shadow Realm. Things that existed in the real world were typically reflected here in the Shadow Realm, revealing their truest, more stripped-down self. However, nothing similar to this, sludge, existed in the circular hall when they were in it. Gawain turned to Amber. "What is this thing?" Amber shrank behind Gawain some more. "I took a mere glance at it, but for some reason it nearly made my mind explode with fear. Even as I think about it, I see its image lingering in my head." Gawain gripped his blade and took another step closer to the sludge. A certain instinct told him the aberration they were fighting above ground was likely related to this blood-red mud. Eliminating the sludge here would put an end to the monster Byron, Heidi, and the rest were fending off. Gawain took another step, but he froze at the sight of the sludge shifting back, exactly a step away from Gawain. Gawain took another step. The sludge retreated back some more. With each step that Gawain took, the sludge shifted back to keep a distance. Amber's look of fear turned into one of befuddlement. "What's going on? This thing seems to be afraid of you." Gawain shook his head. "Rather than fear, I would hazard to say it is something of a biological reflex, like a muscle twitching when you touch a nerve." Gawain made a quicker advance, taking several steps forward. The sludge retreated back, but the billowing smoke remained in the same place. Gawain looked down at dark smoke, about to take a step past it when, through the smoke, he noticed a crevice where the sludge had rested. Gawain stopped, peering down the crevice to see runes and magic crystals emitting a faint light. Gawain raised an eyebrow. "A magic circle?" His head spun with theories and speculations as he drew a deep breath. Impossible. Amber stayed a distance away, unable to see what Gawain had found and unwilling to approach any further. "What happened? Do you see something?" Gawain nodded slowly, still gathering his thoughts. "There's a magic circle here. It must have been placed here by the Gondolian archmages from all those years ago. The facility must be constructed in two parts, one in the physical world and the other here." Amber's eyes widened. She shook her head in disbelief. "No way! Could the humans back then enter the Shadow Realm?" Gawain crouched down over the smoke to get a better look at the magic circle underneath. It certainly didn't occur like this naturally. The people back then may not have even understood what a Shadow Realm was. Yet they clearly understood enough to make some use of it in their research. It's incredible. Using the little bit of knowledge he had of magic circles, he began to decipher the runes. Only a portion of the magic circle appeared to use the typical spell runes and element runes, but there was another portion entirely carved with special symbols. They were sacred seals. These were runes used by religious sects. The symbols were said to originate from the eternal stone tablet used to remove any and all obstructions that block the connection to divine power. Gawain stood up. What he found wasn't a magic circle, but a divine circle. No. There are typical runes here too. This is a cross between a magic circle and a divine circle. The more Gawain examined the circle, the more complex it looked. He noticed 20 rune combinations used for gathering energy and several more arrangements he didn't understand. Energy-gathering runes were considered rare during the Gondolian Empire's meteoric era. After all, most, if not all, magical equipment were powered by the Azure Fount, making it pointless to use self-powering magic circles. Yet this facility in the Shadow Realm had a magic circle that was designed with a complex and massive energy-gathering structure. Black smoke billowed out, and Gawain wafted it away for a better look at the core region of the magic circle. He froze the moment he saw it. "Even if we defied the gods, devouring the flesh of gods, eat heartily." Those maniacal words surfaced in Gawain's mind as he stayed frozen in place. What he saw was a perfect cube of a crystal, encasing a biological tissue at the dead center. This fleshy tissue was dark red, devoid of blood vessels, tendons, muscle, or anything human. A strange fluid circulated within the tissue. Even though it had been sealed by the crystal cube encasing it for 1,000 years, Gawain could see it squirming, beating, bulging. In spite of its twisting, constantly shifting form, Gawain saw it for what it was. It pulsed regularly, rhythmically, a heart. Not the heart of a human, but of something entirely different. Something that needed a divine circle to keep it contained. If the words on the manuscript are true, if the inscriptions along the wall are true, and if the words I heard from the eternal stone tablet are true, there is no mistaking what this is. Gawain gulped. A chill ran down his spine. If the gods are dead, where do their corpses fall? They fall to the realm of mortals. Gawain lifted his sword of the founder. He raised it forward slowly and poked at the crystal cube. The beating heart wriggled a little. Gawain assessed the threat before sheathing his blade. He reached down and picked up the crystal cube. It was heavier than Gawain thought. He felt like he was carrying the weight of a toddler. As the cube left the magic circle surrounding it, the runes and black smoke dissipated at once. The sludge evaporated into black smoke as well, billowing away until it vanished into nothingness. The moaning stopped, and an eerie quietude settled over them. The black and white version of this room was now empty. Nothing was there except Gawain, Amber, and the mysterious heart in a box. Amber stayed a distance away, squinting at what Gawain picked up. What is that? It was the first time in her life seeing something sparkle and not having the immediate thought to steal it. Rather, the mere sight made her blood run cold. Gawain carried the crystal cube over to her. Do you really wish to know? Someone like you should be able to hazard a guess. Amber narrowed her eyes at the box. She looked up at Gawain and shook her head. Gawain decided to help her out. That wasn't an ordinary magic circle. That was a divine circle. Amber's eyes widened. She backed away. You're kidding. Gawain recalled the information he gleaned from the eternal stone tablet. Legend says that there was a war between gods in ancient times. Gods descended to the realm of mortals, allowing mortals to possess divine powers such as magic. Since the gods' powers could fall into the mortal realm, why not also their flesh? Amber nodded, understanding, but decidedly not comforted by this explanation. Gawain knew that Amber would have heard of the War of the Gods. He omitted the speculation that all the gods were already dead, wiped out by some Zenith Galactic fleet, whatever that meant. After all, Amber was a self-proclaimed believer of the goddess of shadows. Amber took a deep breath. She looked away from the flesh. We've got to get out of here. Gawain agreed. He looked down at this heavy cube and felt that strange, unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. It was just like how he felt when he first communicated with the satellite in the sky, and when the eternal stone tablet revealed sounds of a divine massacre to him, except worse. Amber couldn't think of a way to deny it, so she walked away. Gawain didn't blame her. After all, they both knew what they held, the flesh of a god. Gawain and Amber appeared back into the room from the Shadow Realm. Gawain clutched in his hand the crystal cube which held the peculiar divine flesh. As they re-entered the world, they saw Heidi, Sir Byron and their soldiers battling the humanoid aberration. Both of them were sweating, exhausted, bruised and scarred, but still alive. Just as the pair of them appeared, the monster stumbled and seemed to fall as if it was hit by an unseen force. Sir Byron shouted triumphantly and brought his sword down upon the beast with all his might. This time, Sir Byron's sword sliced right through the beast's neck, severing its head. Its body flailed about, and Heidi waved her arms, launching purple lightning into the monster. Mystic fire lit the beast up, and it finally fell limp to the ground. The creature's body sizzled and fried before dissolving into smoke. Heidi wiped her brow, and she turned towards Gawain. Sir Byron sheathed his sword. They beheld their lord and his roguish assistant. Heidi nodded. It's done. But just before you arrived, it was fighting as hard as if it had 1,000 lives to lose. Did you do something in the Shadow Realm to weaken it? Amber and Gawain exchanged looks. Gawain held up the crystal cube. I found this, but I don't know how that affected the aberration. He looked around at the assembled group. The soldiers had wild eyes, and many had sat down to nurse their wounds, even though none looked fatal. Gawain raised his voice to the soldiers. My valiant vassals of Clan Cecil, well done. I must now ask you to wait outside. There are things I must discuss with my lieutenants. Stand guard, tend to your injuries, then I shall summon you. The soldiers dutifully saluted Gawain and made their way out of the chamber, back towards the safely deserted part of the ruin. The only ones remaining were Amber, Sir Byron, Heidi, and Gawain. Sir Byron regarded Gawain suspiciously, his gaze focused on the object in his lord's hands. My lord, what is that? Gawain held up the cube. It was releasing energy in the Shadow Realm, allowing the monster to resurrect itself, even as you felled it again and again. I suspect it also influenced the monster in some way, allowing it to live for 1,000 years and become stronger than all the other beasts of its type. Gawain looked at the astonished faces around him. He sighed to himself. He knew that his suspicions were borderline blasphemous, but keeping them secret would only cause more problems. So he spoke. When I touched the Eternal Stone tablet, I heard voices of some sort of army in the divine realm. They sounded like they were hunting the gods, killing the gods. I didn't believe it to be true, but now that we found this, I suspect it might be related. Heidi's staff slipped from her hands and clattered to the ground. The dame pointed with a shaking finger at the crystal in Gawain's hands. Do you think that could be the flesh and blood of the gods? Gawain had seen Heidi's composure slip every once in a while, but never like this. Heidi seemed genuinely disturbed by this hypothesis. He smiled sympathetically. He spoke carefully, hoping that his words would calm his descendant, not terrify her. I know it's a difficult concept to wrap your mind around. The idea of the gods falling and their flesh landing in the hands of mortals is unsettling. But remember the line in the Mage's Creed. The path to seeking is endless. The gods are also a part of it. Heidi nodded, seeming to calm a bit. She was a believer in the goddess of magic, yet she was a mage first, and the reminder of her brethren's creed was useful. So Gawain continued. I found ancient records of a divine battle. Some of the gods were defeated, and their remains fell into the mortal world when they died. That's where some magical creatures and artifacts come from. Perhaps not all the remains transformed. Maybe the Gondolian Empire found some intact remnants of the gods and built this base to study them. Even though Gawain had hinted about the message from the tablet, he didn't explain it all, erring on the side of legends and euphemisms. After all, explaining how he knew what cannons were would be opening a whole new can of worms. Sir Byron nodded thoughtfully. He stared at the squirming flesh that was held inside the crystalline cage with awe and curiosity. Gawain turned to examine the hall further. There were words on the wall he had not yet read, so he deciphered them. The Gondolian Empire was a height of humanity, but also a peak of humankind's arrogance. Mages were stronger than whole armies, powered by the Azure Font. From a certain perspective, people were almost as powerful as gods in and of themselves. This is probably what they meant by defying the gods. He shook his head slowly. Ultimately, they must have learned that the Azure Font was the only source of power on the continent, and it was far from unlimited. Gondolia was lucky, so when the Empire fell, these ideas died with it. An awkward silence fell over the group. Dame Heidi cleared her throat. Ancestor, what do you plan on doing with this divine flesh? Gawain looked at the sample, still squirming in the cage of crystal. After regarding the tissue for a moment, Gawain looked up at Byron and Heidi. Are either of you experiencing any psychic pain, discomfort, anything like that? Sir Byron and Heidi shook their heads. Sir Byron let out a mirthless chuckle. Besides struggling to comprehend what it is, no. Gawain frowned. He licked his lips slowly. I was wondering, if you two will allow me to perform a test with you, it might cause some discomfort in your minds. Amber did it already, but she's fine. As fine as she usually is, anyway. Amber stuck her tongue out at Gawain. I didn't mean to test it. Gawain waved his hand at her. Byron and Heidi slowly nodded. Gawain took a deep breath. All right. Heidi, Byron, stand right about here. He gestured to a few feet away from the crystal. They stood where he pointed, and Gawain set the crystal cube on the floor. He stood and looked at them. Any discomfort now? They shook their heads. Gawain backed away. He motioned for them to move closer. They did so. As they got closer, Gawain noticed a change in the mass of flesh and blood in the crystal. The thing changed in shape, stretching out like a spiderweb of viscera. Gawain looked Byron and Heidi, and the two of them looked transfixed, as if in a trance. He stepped forward, and as soon as he drew close to the mound of flesh, it calmed and resumed its normal state. Heidi and Byron startled. Heidi especially looked around wildly. "What happened?" Gawain shrugged. "I don't really know. It seems like I can repress this thing's activity, possibly because I've been resurrected. It might respect someone who, like it, defies the law of nature." Heidi nodded slowly. "That could be, but that does raise a troubling question. If you wish to study this, do you have to keep it with you constantly to prevent it from drawing others into a similar state of mental paralysis?" Amber guffawed from a farther corner of the room. "If the chief walked around carrying a piece of divine jerky wherever he went, I think he might get some funny looks." Gawain rolled his eyes at her. "No one will think you've lost your tongue if you remain quiet once in a while." But as annoying as Amber was, he had to admit on some level that she was right. So he had Byron and Heidi repeat the experiment at varying distances. Soon they were able to discover that as long as they didn't focus on the strange thing, they wouldn't be affected by its psychic presence. And the farther they went, the less possessed they became. Well, at least we don't have to send it back to the Shadow Realm. It had been an idea, he considered, but based on how the humanoid aberration drew power from it, that proposition seemed more dangerous than safe. After all, he highly doubted that the mages of Gondolier had placed it there for safekeeping. Following the old Earth adage, it was best to keep one's friends close and one's enemies closer. And until they could find out more about these remains of a god, they would have to treat it as the enemy. Even though it was easy enough to rule out storing the supposed divine sample in the Shadow Realm, they still had to contend with where they would store it. Taking it to the Cecil Township was a no-go, as it was far from being a conventional discovery. Nicholas Egg was one thing. After all, he was sentient and could be communicated with. Yet this tissue was dangerous. Even though Gawain didn't know the extent it could harm people on this plane, he knew in his very bones that it was trouble. Trouble that he wanted to avoid at any cost. So they needed to keep an eye on it, but somewhere where it wouldn't pose any danger to their people. Eventually, Sir Byron suggested something. "We should keep it here, in the ruins themselves." Though at first it seemed like a silly idea, eventually Gawain realized the sanity of it. After all, they had a better sense of the mountain fortress now, and could place it wherever they wished. Examining Byron's map, Gawain found a place that would do nicely as a storage unit. It was an empty room just off of the large winding corridor in the place's central level. It was sturdy, easy to guard, and not centrally located. Gawain didn't know if there was something in the main central hall that could incense this divine sample, but he didn't want to take any risks at all. "Keep it in this room, in a light-proof box or under a similar cloth, at least while I'm not there. Make sure it's completely covered. We can't let anyone look at it in case they are consumed by its psychic power. Then we will designate that room as restricted." Brian and Heidi nodded. Gawain continued. "We should have 2 guards and place them on rotating shifts, so it's watched around the clock. These need to be the most reliable ones you can find, Sir Byron, the type who won't let curiosity get the better of them." Sir Byron saluted. "Yes, my lord." Once Gawain had put this plan into practice, he let out a sigh of relief. But even though he made the practiced motion, the feeling of relief did not follow. He thought of Viscount Andrew, and how relieved the Lord of Tanzan was to give away the eternal stone fragment. "Now, I'm in the same position. I discovered something priceless only to realize it's a ticking time bomb. But it was far worse than the tablet. After all, everyone knew about the eternal stone tablet and its various fragments. The damage that a surviving sample of the god's remains could cause to this world was something that Gawain didn't even dare think about. It could rewrite the very culture of Anzu, throw Lauren itself into chaos, or bring about an end to the centuries of religious peace and tolerance that society had known. One thing it had already changed was Gawain himself. He used to be indifferent to the gods, regarding them as figments of imagination, personifications of unknowable power. But now they were so much more. They were powerful beings who were then destroyed by some sort of interdimensional fleet. Who possesses such immense power? And what do they want? Does this have something to do with the satellite where I was reborn? He shook his head and turned to Sir Byron and Heidi. This incident must be kept a secret. Sir Byron, you and your soldiers should continue your exploration, but exercise caution. Any rooms you find similar to this must be left alone, sealed until I can personally be there to verify it. We're tampering with powers beyond mortal knowledge. Best to act as such. Byron bowed. I understand, my lord. Heidi cleared her throat. She gestured toward the stack of manuscripts that they had partially decoded. Do we bring these back, even if they seem to be the ravings of a long-dead madman? Gawain looked at the stack of manuscripts, but his gaze wandered further, to the beheaded red skeleton which lay on the ground, still disintegrating. In that instant he realized who must have written those manuscripts. He grimaced in sympathy. What a fate! To be abandoned while something otherworldly corrupts your flesh, warps your mind, feeds on your life and gives you nothing in return besides an endless hunger. At least they had finally put an end to this experiment's suffering. He returned his focus to Heidi. Let's store the manuscripts with the crystal cage. Since we don't yet comprehend the true nature of this sample, we should keep them close together so we can study them. The divine sample will be called Primary Sample 1, and the manuscript shall be a derivative of this primary sample. He turned to Byron. As we discover more within these ruins, we should number and store artifacts in accordance with this system. Sir Byron noted this, and Gawain gritted his teeth. I try to bring order to this chaotic world, yet chaos always wins in the end. By the time Gawain, Heidi, and Sir Byron returned to the township, night had fallen. A crescent moon lay a silvery curtain over the series of wooden cabins. Magical lamps cast light onto the main roads, doorways, and places of meeting. It looked like a cluster of stars had fallen from the sky and landed right by the White River. The team's innovations of magic web technology had rendered torches obsolete, or at least made them less essential. Now, magical lamps were the way people kept the lights on at night. Gawain smiled to himself. A huge limitation of humanity had always been their inability to be efficient at night. Yet now, with a consistent and stable light source, their productivity was no longer confined to daytime hours. Following the guiding glow of these lights, Gawain returned to his own tent. He stopped before entering and took it in. He shook his head. I think I might be nearing a time I need to switch to a different dwelling, at least before the elements force me to. Living in a tent for several months was indeed an odd choice. Some presumed that he had done this because he cared more for his people's comfort than himself. Others thought it was because he was used to living in harsh conditions as a pioneer, and a tent suited him better than a cabin. The real reason was practical, as most things were with Gawain. He had already designed his new residence, which would include a laboratory, kitchen, indoor plumbing, and all the works. It was impossible to construct as of now, and Gawain didn't think building a temporary hut was worth the effort. Gawain returned to his cloth dwelling. He chuckled upon seeing Betty lying fast asleep on his desk. She clearly had been sleeping there for quite some time. There were a few pieces of paper scattered about her, with some scribblings on them, which trailed off as she had clearly fallen asleep mid-writing practice. He walked carefully around her, making sure not to disturb her slumber, yet still the maid's ears pricked up and she sat up straight. My lord, you have returned. I wasn't sleeping. I was just resting temporarily. Gawain smirked and motioned to his mouth, indicating where some drool had pooled on Betty's lip. Betty coloured and wiped her mouth. She began to apologize, but Gawain cut her off before she could do so. Were you waiting for me? Did you have a message? Or did you just come in here to practice writing? Betty looked around, her brows knit in concentration. She gathered up the papers as if to hide them. Then she gasped and leapt to her feet, sending parchment flying all over the tent. I remember. Viscountess Rebecca and Miss Jenny came by to look for you and they wanted me to leave you a message. I was practicing writing as I waited for you. Gawain smirked. Good job, you remembered. Betty beamed with pride. Exactly. Miss Jenny wrote it down for me. She pulled out a notebook and showed Gawain a page. She then looked down at it and cleared her throat, as if preparing to read a speech. We've calculated and found the rune mold, the mold. She trailed off, and her eyes grew big with frustration. I'm sorry, my lord. I don't know this word. Gawain walked over to the other side of her and looked at the book. He read the message Jenny had written for him. You're doing very well, Betty. Thank you. Now would you please go get them for me? Betty nodded and rushed toward the entrance. Before leaving the tent, she paused and turned back to Gawain. My lord, what was that word? Gawain grinned. Scorching ray. Gawain barely had time to take a drink from his water skin before Rebecca and Jenny arrived in his tent. They carried with them a bulging bag. Gawain cleared off the crystals from his desk as they walked in. Rebecca took a quick curtsy toward Gawain and asked him a question. Lord Ancestor, what did you find in the remnants? Aunt Heidi looked, well, like she usually does, but sadder. Like something awful happened. Same with Sir Byron. Both were looking beaten up, like you had a fight or something. Gawain shook his head. It's difficult to explain. I will tell you later, but for now, let's focus on your discovery. I'm more eager to hear some good news than I am to unpack news that is complicated at best. Rebecca nodded quickly and turned her attention to the bag which she and Jenny held. Gawain smiled. She was enthusiastic and intelligent, but it was easy to divert her attention. Look at these. We designed the rune combinations. So far, every calculation we made on paper has played out exactly as we predicted when we implement it. As she spoke, she removed several scrolls and pulled out a metal plate which she slapped on the desk promptly. Gawain's eyes widened. Did you already create it? Rebecca looked away, slightly embarrassed. No, just got a test subject. We talked to Egg and carved a prototype by hand. Gawain picked up one of their scrolls and unfurled it. Upon the page were written many lines and runes, far more intricately drawn than those of the magic web, but also somehow more simple. It was as if the entire style of drawing was simpler. They had removed useless structures and focused on the practical. Gawain nodded. Rune carving was an art that often had to do with aesthetics as much as it had to do with practical applicability, but Rebecca and Jenny had approached it from a purely functional standpoint, removing anything artistic and focusing on the math instead. Gawain picked up the base plate. The runes carved on it were just as practical, simple but elegant. The base was made of copper, and the notches seemed to be reinforced with quartz, sand powder, and blood tree resin, all useful materials, and common enough that mass-producing them shouldn't be an issue. He looked up at Jenny. You carved this? Jenny straightened her back and nodded. Yes, Lord. Gawain smiled. Well done. Have you tested it? Rebecca did a small jump of excitement. Yes! We used the energy supply from the magic web. See that groove by the fire rune? That's where it would launch the scorching ray. Gawain looked at what she was indicating. Underneath a fire rune was a groove which looked not dissimilar to the barrel of a gun, reinforced with quartz. Once this circle had been activated, it could launch concentrated scorching rays as far as almost 500 feet, maybe farther. Rebecca continued her analysis, barely pausing for breath. The issue is that we can only use it within the range of the magic web. It can't produce magical power by itself, so it needs a source. Gawain reached under the desk and opened a drawer. From it, he pulled out the magic capacitor he had shown Amber earlier that day. I think I might have the solution you're looking for. Rebecca's eyes widened. What's this? Gawain handed it to her without answering her question. He watched her examine it, like an archaeologist uncovering meaning in symbols and grooves. After a moment, she looked back up with a frown on this. I've tried this. It doesn't produce enough energy to fuel the other magic circle. Gawain nodded and gestured at the bag of magic storage crystals. I thought of that, which is why we acquired all these magic storage crystals. He stood. Come now, to the magical manufacturing facility. Fetch Nicholas Egg too. We'll need his help to assemble this. Rebecca snapped a salute and tugged Jenny by the elbow. Jenny had been busily scrawling notes in her notebook and practically fell over herself as Rebecca pulled her out of the tent. But before they could exit, Amber appeared before them from the shadows. She excitedly jumped in the air. "I'll go too!" Rebecca screamed and launched a fireball at Amber. Gawain quickly drew the sword of the founder and sliced the fireball out of the air. Rebecca smiled sheepishly at the disgruntled Amber. "Sorry." Even though night was settled on the Cecil township and most of the peasants had either gone to bed or were settling in for their repast, the magical manufacturing facility was brightly lit as it ever could be, the clamour of machines banging along from within. This was where Clan Cecil brought newly forged steel parts and had them built and constructed like blueprints, or reinforced and recast by Nicholas Egg. Gawain, Rebecca, Jenny and Amber entered the facility. What beheld them was a truly astonishing sight. Even at this late hour, workers bustled to and fro, bringing pieces of iron to various work tables, for them to be fitted together into larger components, or hammered and further shaped. On the western side of the shed was the magic-powered engine, which roared and bellowed and drove the processing machinery, producing all sorts of small components that would be needed for bigger machines. But Gawain was most impressed by the human craftsmen, who now operated in this prototype of a factory as if they had been trained from a young age, not just from their arrival a week or so ago. In the middle of it all floated Nicholas Egg. The strange metal sphere made pieces of iron and steel float about him, being moulded into all kind of parts which needed the craft and specificity that only this alien ball could provide. Rebecca stepped forward and hollered over the sound of machinery. "Egg, Egg, we need you to help us!" The sphere turned and faced them. "Oh, hello, Gawain! Hello, others! Welcome!" Gawain started. Normally he wouldn't be able to tell that the sphere had turned around, since it had nothing that could be described as a face. However, that had changed. Nicholas Egg now had a cartoon smiley face drawn upon one side of him, so from one angle he looked like a giant floating cartoonish smile. He stared at Nicholas's new face for a moment. In the magical lantern light, it looked like the face itself was giving him a sly wink, as if somebody had known his secret and wished to tell him so. He was about to ask the obvious question, when Rebecca tapped him on the shoulder. "What do you think of his new face?" He raised his eyebrows. "You drew a face on him?" Rebecca nodded with a satisfied smile on her lips. "Yeah. It turns out it's hard to communicate with someone when you don't know which way they're facing. Also, he started complaining when people would sneak up behind him, so we compromised and gave him a face." Gawain cocked his head at Nicholas Egg. He was slightly unsettled at how much like a text message smiley the face looked. It was almost as if Rebecca were a transmigrator herself and wanted to imitate an emoji. What was the inspiration for this? He couldn't shake how knowing the smile was. Rebecca nodded, not noticing her ancestor's discomfort. "I just wanted to draw him smiling, but my hand wobbled a bit, so it's not perfect, but I think it came across as pretty charming." The corners of Gawain's mouth twitched. "What do others think about the face?" Rebecca rubbed her chin and looked over at Jenny. "What do you think, Jenny? I think people were pretty pleased when they saw him." Jenny readily nodded. "Oh yes, people seemed to relax more around him." Nicholas Egg floated over to Gawain. "Do you like my new face? Your brains seem to be programmed to respond to faces, so I think I've hacked everyone's minds." Gawain gave the sphere a withering look. Nicholas realized the implications of what he just said. "I mean, since I was a human myself, I remember liking faces." Gawain rolled his eyes. "As long as you're happy." He pulled out his bag of materials. "But enough pleasantries. We need your help building a weapon." The emoji turned on his side. "A weapon? What is it?" Gawain smiled. "A ray gun." Even as he said it out loud, Gawain had a sense of what this could mean. Their civilization had come so far in the last few months, but with their recent discoveries they needed more help than they could have possibly imagined. They weren't just facing monsters that destroyed an empire. They would be facing the people that destroyed the gods. Thank you so much for listening to Eternal Emperor. If you enjoyed the adventures of Gawain, Heidi, Rebecca and Amber, Please explore the Pocket FM app for other exciting dramas, thrilling romances, and transportive fantasies.